back to the Behavioral Gabaret. I'm Carrie Woodward, a board certified behavior analyst and an early intervention specialist.
And I'm Javen Encarnacion, a behavior analyst and a consultant.
Today, we're diving into chapter 26 of Science and Human Behavior, which is all about education. Skinner argues that the real problem isn't the kids, it's the contingencies. Schools reinforce the wrong behaviors, compliance, memorization, and anxiety.
Yeah, and what we know is that real teaching is just engineering and identifying reinforcement, arranging environments so that learning itself is reinforcing, not the gold star at the end.
That's right. We'll explore what happens when curiosity replaces coercion, why Skinner thought the lecture was the worst invention since punishment, and what he'd think of TikTok classrooms.
So he'd probably be building a teaching machine, I think, and go viral for it.
Totally. All right. So Skinner says that the real goal of education isn't obedience or grades. It's building repertoires of behavior that will be useful later. And yet most systems still reinforce knowing over doing. So, Javen, you've worked in schools a lot and you've had a lot of experience in education. Why do you think that schools still lean so hard on like these arbitrary reinforcers like grades, when the whole point is supposed to be real world competence?
I think part of it is because of in many ways it's the systems that we have that it's built on. So education is tied to so many different things from a national and policy level.
Right.
And there are different approaches and aspects to education and different and like so many other things, there's beliefs about education and beliefs about what the right and wrong way to teach, and everyone has an opinion on what education should look like. So it when you have something that's so ingrained and cultural in that way, it's hard to get people to shift away from that. And so I've worked in an approach to a scientific approach to teaching using built on behavior analysis and for general ed and for special education populations. And one of the hardest things is to get teachers to shift away from these ideas about how instruction is supposed to be delivered and shifting the blame away. So in a
Mm.
lot of just like anything else, when students don't learn, it's usually the student's fault. They weren't motivated. They didn't do what they were supposed to. It's the parents' fault. The parents weren't making them do X, Y, or Z. When reality is that teaching is it's something that we do and experiences that we're providing to learners. And if they're not learning, then we didn't teach correctly.
Oh,
And so it's learning is a function of our teaching, not a function of whether students prepared. And I think that that shift is very hard for people.
so hard. That was one of the most refreshing things about my master's program was hearing Hank Schlingert say, if you guys take a test and you all miss a question, we're throwing the question out. It means that I didn't prepare you to take that to answer that question. Like your learning is a reflection of my teaching, and if it's not working, that means I need to make a change. It does not mean that you guys aren't like the problem lies with you. And it was the first time that I'd ever heard teaching described in that way. I don't know the answer to this. Are teachers required to do like continuing education? Because
Yeah.
are they? To maintain
But
their credentials?
yes. But the issue is that the continuing education practices are still based on sometimes even pseudoscientific
Right.
ideas, like the idea of like multiple intelligences, which has been debunked a long time ago. And so the practices around education aren't always evidence-based, and curricular design isn't always evidence-based. And even when they purport to be, that's often not the case. But I think something that's been really cynical for me, or that makes me feel cynical, is that the things that we would consider archaic now, so like different strategies that were maybe had their place or were novel at the time, so behavior charts and things like that, those are still utilized, although they aren't utilized correctly most of the time. And there are different behavior management procedures like clip down charts. I
Yes.
hate those. D- like those are punishment procedures, and that's
Right.
what has main that is what has stayed. The things that we no longer even utilize.
There must be some sort of automatic reinforcement built in for teachers to continue sticking with systems that are ineffective in actual classroom behavior management. Like, I can't tell you how many classrooms I've been in, and I'm like, you're doing what now? Oh, you're having them fill up this giant jar of puff balls, and I can see that there are three balls in there. How
Mhm.
long does it take us to get to the end? You know, like that clearly doesn't work. And yet we're still tied to these old systems that we know are ineffective. So there has to be something in it for the teachers that they're like that their behavior is being reinforced in utilizing these. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be, the observations when principals do observations in a school. It could be that calling, oh, look,
Oh,
I like how you have this in place. And some of those systems do work probably most of the time, or even some of the time. Like it being a teacher manage one person managing a classroom of 30, a punishment procedure is going to be really effective for most students, especially with uh if they have the right contingencies and the right things that function as punishers in place. But for many students, especially the ones who have challenges, who are
yeah,
not going to respond to those things, they aren't effective. And so
totally.
I think there's, the teachers also oftentimes don't have access to what would be effective. And that,
Or support from somebody who knows what they're doing. I know
exactly.
that this gets us a little off track, but there's like some behavior concerns in my daughter's second grade, not her class specifically, but there are three second grade classrooms, and there are six students that are really struggling. And I was talking to a mom, and she was like, "Yeah, they've just been sending that student out to a different classroom when he's being disruptive as like a punishment." She's like, "But I sort of feel like he likes it there." And I asked him, like, are you enjoying your time in that other class? And he was like, yes, it's a much, like, it's quieter, it's calmer. And she's like, so I suggested to the teacher that maybe she needs to now make that a reward when he's doing that. And I was just like, you're a mom with zero background at all. Like, why don't we have a behavior analyst that's helping to support this teacher that has six students that have severe, like, significant behavior concerns and designing programs that are actually based in science as opposed to just like guessing? And then, I mean, it's just crazy to me.
I think that's also probably something that has been that there's a lot of research now about with approaches to restorative justice and
Mm,
in restorative puni or practices in education. And I haven't seen the data. I have a friend who works in policy, and she writes about it a lot. And she's a behavior analyst, and she's written about how it hasn't actually worked, because many times the policies like suspensions and stuff, we know those aren't effective.
right.
Oftentimes it's utilized to for a variety of reasons, maybe to make it more aversive for the parent so that way they can do school to home contingencies, or to get the ball rolling for some type of evaluation if a learner has special education needs, or they need a 504 plan or an IEP. And
Yeah.
so I think the issue is that whenever those systems were pulled out, the the restorative practices didn't provide the documentation and the paper trail to support the students who have alternative needs. Because I this is just me going off of what I think, but it seems like schools may not have been prepared to address the challenges that they were going to face once IDEA and FATE became a thing.
Yeah. And it's been what, 20 years have we had that?
Probably longer.
Yeah.
I don't know the timeline.
We
Uh,
we should have figured it out at this point. It's
And
weird.
but so and I guess going back to Skinner, he was calling for progressive education as an attempt to replace contrived reinforcers with natural ones. That's something that's really common in the practice that I was trained in, is bringing we utilize token economies and group contingencies, but the goal is to bring to develop a love for learning and
Yes.
to bring all of that under natural reinforcers. So what are we expecting the students to do once all of these things are removed, and letting curiosity, discovery, and success in the task itself do the teaching? Do you think that approach actually works in modern classrooms, or are we still trapped in systems that reward compliance rather than
I
learning?
mean, it can work, but unless it's been designed for a teacher, I feel like you then just sort of rely on a teacher getting really creative in how to make these, I mean, they're given a curriculum that they have to teach. So if that curriculum is not inherently like enjoyable for a student, then you have to bring some level of novelty and fun to the experience in order to build that natural engagement and reinforcement into the experience. And so then we're sort of relying on teachers to develop that on their own, right? Like, unless there is like evidence-based practice on how to do these lessons in ways that build kids in. And also, in terms of like rewarding compliance, what I think is so funny is like at some point you see teachers just being like, stop putting your hands up, like stop asking questions, just listen. And you're like, you want kids to ask questions, like you want to reinforce curiosity. That if you can reinforce curiosity, then you provide this lifelong desire for learning new things, and that's what sets people up to be successful adults, I would say. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I do you know of any systems that like help these teachers sort of bring that value to the experience to make it more naturally reinforcing for kids?
Yes, many of them, and probably more than we can even go into. I think the one of the things that's the hardest is providing teachers with the support that they need and opportunities, and not just telling them or like a PD workshop, but actually giving them the resources to do it and strategies to effectively manage these situations. So one thing that we would do oftentimes is break the class up into small groups
Uh-huh.
and try to meet the students where they are and teach more to their skill level to fill in gaps, because students are coming in with significant gaps. Everyone has a different learning history, but there's a lot of pressure in public schools to teach to the standardized test. And so what we've taught for a long time is memorization, and the
Yeah.
extraction of the skill hasn't occurred. And the love for learning in a lot of procedures and things that schools do make learning somewhat punishing. And so I
Mm.
think teachers are have so much on their plate. I feel for teachers a lot. They have,
Yeah.
lesson plans uh and so many different demands, and as the student needs are growing, it gets really hard for teachers to manage. And that's why I think we're seeing the burnout that we're seeing. And the strategies that can be effective, they don't have access to, and then or they don't have the materials. And so
Yeah.
the level of support, I think, isn't there, which is one of the reasons we're not seeing the change that we need.
Which is such a shame.
Yeah.
In addition to uh, Skinner's argument about like the role of reinforcement in education, he's also talking about like mostly punishment based discipline in these schools. But as we have faded those out, that schools sort of sometimes lose control,
Yeah.
right? Um, and that the schools then move to replacing that with things like entertainment or visual aids. Do we feel like education has really evolved, or have we just sort of swapped one kind of control for another? And what could a truly non-coercive education even look like? Like the strategies that you have employed in schools, does that work on a broad scale with general education students and curriculum?
Hmm. Yes. However, it comes down, I got intensive training with
Yeah.
doctoral level teachers slash behavior analysts. So the degree of training that they need is going to be really important. Um, what does a non-coursive education even look like? There's this system that was revolutionary back in like the 40s and 50s, and then it kind of went away. But you'll see different models. There are different models that are really effective, that are evidence based. So like the Morningside model in Seattle, that uses precision teaching and
Right.
fluency, and they
Right.
can close gaps really quickly. The We used the PSI system once students had robust reader writer skills, or as they were starting to develop them, and that allowed them to kind of learn at their own pace. So the students who take more time get the time. Students who learn quicker are we're able to meet them, and you're not doing this thing where you're covering content and then testing and then just moving on. I think that's what happens a lot of time, is the mastery isn't there.
Let's talk about that really quickly for anybody who's not familiar, PSI, personalized systems of
Oh.
instruction, and how like what some of the problems in a general classroom are is that you have students that are behind where they need to be or students that are above where they need to be, and so then they get bored, right? Or they're not accessing the natural reinforcement contingencies in the material because they've already done it. They already know it. And so what you're saying is that a PSI system has kids working at their own pace on the material at their level and only advancing on once they hit mastery criteria, right? How does a teacher manage a group of students and do classroom lessons? Or is it always in small pods where like kids who are similar in their areas are here, kids who are similar in their areas are here, and we're doing small group lessons rather than large group instruction?
I um a lot of times when we've done it, it was in uh small pods. So
Yeah,
breaking the group up into like the classroom into groups of three and then teaching that way. And there are different ways you can do it. You can do an exposure lesson where you go over the content, then you break up the class into small groups. It really depends on what you have access to. And that allows them to go at their own pace. Then they all have their own like PSI folder or something where
right.
they can go over content, you grade it, and they keep that's what was revolutionary is they keep
Yes.
recycling. So they keep
Yes.
if they get 70%, you don't just move on. You teach to mastery. So we had it like a 90% criteria because whatever learner masters something is where they're going to typically maintain it. So when you think about how the C is the the standard, when you think about the bell curve, so there's this idea
Yeah.
that the majority of students should be getting about 70%. Um, when you do that, the majority of your student population is only going to have about 70% of the content in repertoire when they move on to the next grade. So,
Which makes building in complexity incredibly difficult because it's not truly a mastered skill. And I
mhm,
feel like that's sort of where the No Child Left Behind was hoping to be is
yeah.
like we don't advance students until they're prepared for it. And what the contingency did was just have teachers advance students that didn't actually meet the criteria for advancement. And so now all of a sudden you have kids in various settings where they literally don't know how to read yet and they're in sixth grade. And you're like,
And
how did you get here?
that I think that all goes back to how many of these things are designed by people who don't have experience in education, or
Yeah.
the contingencies aren't serving the function that we
Yeah.
want to serve. And so you really need a functional analysis to do many of these things to have the effect that you want to have. But uh, do I think that education has significantly changed? I don't think so. I see a lot of the same tactics, just rebranded. So
Yeah.
there are some initiatives though. So schools are becoming more database now, and you're like there's a science of reading, a science.
Uh-huh.
I think there's a science of math that's been developed recently, and
Yeah.
so that's really good because it's calling to these evidence-based practices and disseminating it in a way that's effective for teachers, but do oftentimes it seems like things that are we've known to be true for some years, and in some ways they're just rebranded. So
Change happens very, very slowly
mm,
over a long period of time. Well, if there's anything that Skinner writes about, I mean, he covers every single topic in this book and is able to provide a really beautiful explanation of how you can address these topics through the behavioral lens. But I think education is one of those ones that just has like bright flashing lights for me because it fails so often in our real life, everyday life. And yet he describes how we can utilize our tools in order to benefit education for all populations, not just kids with special needs. So I really appreciated this chapter, and I really appreciate your insight because you have a lot more experience working in the schools. And I think that's a really cool perspective to bring.
oh, thank you. Well, glad to talk about education any day.
All right, so like and subscribe so
Yep.
that you can see more of our stuff.
It's the